What is up, everyone? My name is Joseph, and welcome back to Casually Competitive MTG, where it's our goal to give you semi-competitive EDH gameplay content that is both fast-paced and entertaining. For the last episode of Season 1, before the finale or the consolation or the favorites match takes place, we wanted to do something a little special for you, and that thing is another double header. So enjoy 2 games of this pod today. The timestamps for the beginnings of each game are on screen if you want to skip around or watch them in chunks, but this is just kind of our way to say thank you for the massive support in Season 1. Before we get into the deck introductions, I do have a few quick channel promotions. First off, if you like what we do and you want to help support us financially so we can improve the quality of these videos, we do have a Patreon, link in the description. If you are a fan of our content, I do think you'll really enjoy the reward system we have set up. Secondly, we have a Discord. If you're interested in talking to us or just joining our community, go ahead and join that as well. The link for the server is in the description. And lastly, if you are looking to buy cards and want to support us just passively, we have a TCG affiliate link in the description. You can actually just check out any of the deck lists down there, and any purchase you make on TCG Player immediately after will help support our channel. No cost to you. It's kind of just an easy win. So if you do want to help us out in that way, that is available. Without any further ado, let's get into the deck introductions and opening hands. Going first today, we have Nate playing Neheb the Eternal. The main goal of this mono red deck is to get Neheb out early, ideally with haste, and then use his triggered ability to generate a lot of mana to assemble one of the combos that are in this deck. One being infinite combat steps with aggravated assault and Neheb's own ability, another one being a Kiki Jiki Zealous Conscripts combo, and there are also a lot of cards in here that just do passive damage that just help ramp out a little bit and sometimes get in the damage that is needed. Nate's opening hand today contained a Mountain, a Razaketh the Molten Pinnacle, a Strip Mine, a Faithless Looting, a Pyroblast, a Shattering Spree, and a Price of Glory. Going next today, we have Jordan playing Kefnet Turns. The goal of this other monocolor deck is to use Kefnet's ability and the color he is in order to control the board and eventually set up infinite turns. The way that Kefnet's ability is helpful here is if you have an extra spell turn in hand, if you have any way to continually put that back on the top of your library through maybe a Jace the Mind Sculptor or a Scroll Rack, you can every turn cast the copy using his ability, taking infinite turns. The cards in Jordan's opening hand were a Snow-Covered Island, a Gemstone Caverns, a Spell Pierce, a Sensei's Divining Top, a Mystic Remora, a Merchant Scroll, and a Rhystic Study. Going third, we have Bill playing Kaalia of the Vast. One of the goals of this deck is to get Kaalia out fast in order to get good value off of using her ability, cheating in expensive and helpful creatures in order to assemble a combo like World Gorger Dragon and Animate Dead in order to generate infinite mana, and then also finding an outlet. Another combo includes Bolas the Citadel, Sensei's Divining Top, and Aetherflux Reservoir, which allows him to gain an obscene amount of life by recasting Sensei's Divining Top over and over and winning through Aetherflux Reservoir. Bill's opening hand contained a Command Tower, a Bloodstained Mire, a Phyrexian Reclamation, an Azra Oddsmaker, a Necromancy, a Linvala Keeper of Silence, and a World Gorger Dragon. And finally today we have Adam playing Alela Artful Provocateur. This deck is actually a polymorph deck, which looks to cast polymorph targeting one of the fairy creature tokens that Alela produces in order to get Razaketh to the battlefield, and then use Razaketh's ability, sacrificing the tokens to tutor up his cheap mana rocks to his hand, and then cast them, generating more fairy creature tokens, which he can use to tutor more in order to get the cards he needs and the mana he needs in order to assemble a win using a Demonic Consultation and a Laboratory Maniac or Jace Wielder of Mysteries. Adam's opening hand contained a Flooded Strand, a Polluted Delta, a Glacial Fortress, a Watery Grave, an Orzhov Signet, a Mortify, and an Utter End. Now with the opening hands and the deck introductions out of the way, let's get into the gameplay. To kick off today's game, Jordan starts with the first pre-game action we've ever had on the channel, and since he is not going first and it was in his opening hand, puts a Gemstone Cavern onto the field, exiles a card from his hand, and puts a luck counter on it. Nate then goes to his first turn, draws, plays a Razaketh tapped as his land for a turn, and then gives the turn to Jordan. Jordan draws and plays a Snow-Covered Island as his land for turn, and then taps this island to cast a Mystic Remora. It resolves, and he then taps his Gemstone Caverns to cast a Sensei's Divining Top. With nothing left, he gives the turn to Bill. Bill draws and plays a Command Tower as his land for turn, and then gives the turn to Adam. Adam draws, plays a Flooded Strand as his land for turn, and then ships the turn back to Nate. Nate untaps, draws, and plays a mountain as his land for turn, and with nothing left to do at this point, gives the turn to Jordan. Jordan untaps and in his upkeep pays for the Remora, hoping to get some value from it. He then draws and plays a snow-covered island as his land for turn. He then passes the turn to Bill. Bill untaps, draws, and plays a Bloodstained Mire as his land for turn, and then decides to carry on the tradition of starving the fish and passes the turn to Adam. On Bill's end step, Adam pays 1 life to crack his Flooded Strands and tutors up a Fetid Pools to the battlefield. He then goes to his turn, untaps, draws, and plays a Polluted Delta as his land for turn, again not playing any spells, not feeding the fish, and giving the turn to Nate. Nate untaps, draws, and plays a Strip Mine as his land for turn. He then taps for 3 mana to cast a Price of Glory. He's not able to pay for the Mystic Remora trigger. Jordan draws a card, and then Jordan taps for 1 blue mana to cast a Spell Pierce, targeting the Price of Glory. Jordan passes priority on Spell Pierce, and Bill immediately taps for a red mana to cast a red Elemental Blast, targeting Spell Pierce, really wanting that Price of Glory to stick. He cannot pay for Mystic Remora, so Jordan draws again, and in response to the red Elemental Blast, Jordan pays 1 mana into Sensei's Divining Top to look at the top 3 cards. He rearranges them, and then red Elemental Blast resolves, and the Price of Glory enters the battlefield. With nothing left, Nate passes the turn to Jordan. Jordan untaps and in his upkeep decides to let the fish go to his graveyard and not pay for it. He then draws and plays a Cavern of Souls, and as it enters the battlefield, he names Zombie. He then taps his mana to cast an uncounterable God Eternal Kefnet. With nothing left, he passes the turn to Bill. On Jordan's end step, Bill pays 1 life to crack his Bloodstained Mire, and he tutors up a Blood Crypt to the battlefield, and he has it enter tapped. He then goes to his turn and untaps, draws, and then taps for 1 black mana to cast a Phyrexian Reclamation. With nothing left to do on this turn, he passes the turn to Adam. On Bill's end step, Adam pays 1 life to crack his Polluted Delta to search up an irrigated farmland. He then goes to his turn, untaps, draws, and shocks in a Watery Grave as his land for turn, taking 2 damage. He then taps for 1 black mana to cast a Dark Ritual, and then uses that 3 floating black mana, along with a little bit extra, to cast Alela, Artful Provocateur, floating a single black mana. With nothing left, he gives the turn over to Nate. Nate untaps, draws, and for 1 red mana, casts Faithless Looting, drawing 2 cards, and then discarding 2 cards. One of the cards discarded was a Blightsteel Colossus, which shuffles back into Nate's library when it hits the graveyard. He then taps for 2 mana to cast a Mind Stone. With nothing left to do, he passes the turn to Jordan. Jordan untaps, and in response to going to his draw step, pays 1 mana to activate Sensei's Divining Top, rearranging the top 3 cards of his library. He then draws and plays a Snow-Covered Island as his land for turn. He then taps for 3 mana to cast a Rhystic Study. It resolves, and he then goes to combat, swinging Kefnet at Bill for 4 damage. Bill declares no blockers, takes 4 commander damage, and then in his second main phase, Jordan taps for 1 blue mana to cast Portent. It resolves, and then he passes the turn to Bill. Bill untaps, and in his upkeep, Jordan draws from the Portent trigger. Bill then draws, and plays a Silent Clearing as his land for turn. He then taps for 3 mana to cast an Azra Oddsmaker, trying to get some card advantage in this game, and not paying for the Rhystic Study, allowing Jordan to draw. The Azra Oddsmaker resolves, and Bill then goes to pass the turn to Adam. Adam untaps, draws, and plays a Glacial Fortress untapped as his land for turn. He then taps for 2 mana to cast an Orzhov Signet, immediately tapping for 1 more to pay for the Rhystic Study tax. On cast, he generates a 1/1 Fairy Creature token, and then it resolves and enters the battlefield. With nothing left, Adam passes the turn to Nate. Nate untaps, draws, and plays a tapped Boseiju Who Shelters All as his land for turn. He then taps his mana to cast a Seething Song, not paying for the Rhystic Study tax. When it resolves, he adds 5 red mana to his mana pool. He then uses this red mana to cast his commander, Neheb the Eternal, again not paying for Rhystic Study. Jordan draws, Neheb resolves, and Nate then passes the turn to Jordan. Jordan untaps, draws, and plays another Snow-Covered Island as his land for turn. He then taps for 5 mana to cast a Gilded Lotus. When that resolves, he goes to combat and decides to, again, swing Kefnet at Bill. Bill declares no blockers and takes 4 more Kefnet damage. Jordan then passes the turn over to Bill. Bill untaps, draws, and decides to immediately go to combat, discarding a World Gorger Dragon to the Azra Oddsmaker trigger. He then declares the Oddsmaker as an attacker at Jordan, who declares no blockers. Jordan then takes 3 damage, and Bill then draws 2 cards. In his second main phase, Bill plays an Exotic Orchard as his land for turn, and then taps his mana to cast a Toxic Deluge, paying for Rhystic Study, and also paying 6 life into the spell. He takes 1 damage from Silent Clearing being tapped for a mana, and then in response to the Toxic Deluge, Jordan taps his Gilded Lotus to flash in a Snapcaster Mage, and when it enters the battlefield, he targets Spell Pierce in his graveyard. He then uses the floating blue mana he has from Gilded Lotus to cast this Spell Pierce, targeting the Toxic Deluge. The Spell Pierce resolves, the Deluge is countered, and with nothing left, Bill passes the turn to Adam. Adam untaps, draws, and plays a River of Tears as his land for turn. He then taps his mana to cast a Mortify, targeting Neheb and paying 1 additional mana for the Rhystic Study tax. Mortify resolves, Neheb is destroyed, and Adam then gives the turn over to Nate. Nate untaps, draws, and then taps for 1 red mana to cast a Pyroblast, targeting the Rhystic Study and paying an extra mana for the tax. It resolves and Rhystic Study is destroyed. He then, for 0 mana, casts a Mana Crypt. He then taps for 2 mana to cast a Ruby Medallion. He then taps for a red to cast a Braid, it being reduced by 1 due to Ruby Medallion, targeting Alela. It resolves, deals 3 damage to Alela, and Alela then dies. With nothing left, he passes the turn over to Jordan. Jordan untaps, draws, and taps his mana to cast a Soothsaying. He then, not wanting to lose his land due to Price of Glory, decides to main phase activate Sensei's Divining Top for 1 mana, rearranging the top 3 cards of his library. He then passes the turn over to Bill. Bill, who has a World Gorger Dragon in his graveyard, happily untaps, draws, and immediately goes to combat, and discards a Dark Confidant to the Azra Oddsmaker trigger. He then declares the Oddsmaker as an attacker at Nate, who declares no blockers. Nate then takes 3 damage, and Bill then draws 2 cards. In his second main phase, Bill plays a Swamp as his land for turn. He then taps his mana to cast an Animate Dead, targeting the World Gorger Dragon in his graveyard. Knowing it's now or never, Jordan taps his Gilded Lotus to float 3 blue mana, and then uses 1 of that mana to activate his Sensei's Divining Top, holding priority, and then taps his Sensei's Divining Top to put the other activated ability on the stack. They each resolve, so he first draws a card and puts Sensei's back on top, and then he reorders the top 3 cards of his library. And then finally, in response to the Animate Dead, exiles a Windfall from his hand and pays 1 life to cast a Force of Will without paying its mana cost. The Force of Will resolves, and the Animate Dead is countered. Bill then decides to tap his mana to cast a Necromancy, again targeting the World Gorger Dragon in his graveyard. There are no more responses, unfortunately, to this cast, and Bill then shows us his loop to generate infinite mana. The loop goes as follows. The World Gorger Dragon will enter the battlefield, exiling all permanents he controls. The Necromancy gets exiled along with this, and the Necromancy's leaving the battlefield ability triggers, sacrificing World Gorger Dragon. All permanents that were exiled with World Gorger Dragon return to the battlefield, including Necromancy, which will again target the World Gorger Dragon. The World Gorger Dragon will then enter the battlefield again, and in response to the ETB, Bill will tap all of his mana-producing permanents to float the mana, and then his permanents get exiled again, starting the loop back up. He does this until he has infinite mana of all the colors that he could produce, and he ends the combo by finally targeting his Dark Confidant in his graveyard with Necromancy. The end state of this loop is Bill having an infinite amount of mana of all of his colors, and a Dark Confidant on the battlefield, and a World Gorger Dragon in his graveyard. Now you may think it's over here, however, Bill does still need an outlet. So, using some of his black mana, he casts a Bolas's Citadel. He then uses 1 of his floating mana to cast a Sensei's Divining Top. This will start another non-infinite loop that will allow Bill to tap his Sensei's Divining Top, to draw a card and then put the Divining Top on top of his library. You can then, through Bolas's Citadel, pay 1 life to recast the Divining Top, essentially drawing 1 card for 1 life. He repeats this loop 20 times until he draws the card he needs. He then uses some of his infinite floating mana to cast a Razaketh the Foulblooded. This creature resolves, and he then pays 2 life and sacrifices his Azra Oddsmaker to tutor up a card to his hand. With this card now in his hand, he uses as much of his infinite mana as he needs to continually cast and buy back Searing Touch to deal 1 damage to each of his opponents, and proceeds to recast the spell enough times to finish off his opponents. Now, you may be thinking that this game wasn't enough of a taste of these commanders and you want some more content. Well, luckily we have another game coming right up. But before we get into that game, I want to do a very brief post-game recap to just highlight some cards that I thought were very useful in this game. The first being Price of Glory. This card, even though it was cast by Nate, allowed Bill a little bit of protection and caused some hesitation from Jordan, eventually not allowing Jordan to have the cards he needed when he needed them. Jordan, being a little bit more reserved with his instant speed interaction, really just gave Bill a little bit more freedom than he would have normally had. So if you're ever wondering why Bill decided to keep that Price of Glory around, it eventually helped him win the game, and I think Bill knew that being on the battlefield really just enabled him immensely. The second card I want to talk about is Azra Oddsmaker. This card is insanely good in colors that may not always have the most reliable card advantage draw. Black does have a lot of good draw spells, but red is sometimes a little lacking in terms of card advantage. So having this and being able to not only dump good cards like World Gorger Dragon in your graveyard or good reanimation targets in your graveyard, but also being able to deal 3 damage and draw 2 cards is insane value for a 3 CMC creature, and because of that, I think this kind of deserves like a co-MVP spot for card of the game for this game. That all being said, I don't want to spend too much time in this post-game recap, so let's get into the second game we have planned for you today. Welcome back, everyone, to game number 2 of this pod. As a quick disclaimer, in terms of the season and the tournament goes, the winner of game 1 is the one that we'll be playing in the finale. This is kind of just a bonus game to showcase some more of these decks. In game 2, turn order switched around a little bit, so going first today we have Adam playing the same Alela deck. In his opening hand contained a City of Brass, an Enlightened Tutor, a Personal Tutor, a Mental Misstep, a Diabolic Intent, an Azorius Signet, and a Toxic Deluge. Going second, we have Nate piloting again Neheb the Eternal, and his opening hand contains 2 Mountains, a Dwarven Ruins, a Shattering Spree, a Generator Servant, a Wheel of Fortune, and a Chaos Warp. Going third, we have Jordan playing his Kefnet Infinite Turns deck, and his opening hand contained 3 Snow-Covered Islands, a Ponder, a Muddle the Mixture, a Mirror Maid, and a Jace the Mind Sculptor. And going last in this second game, we have Bill playing Kaalia of the Vast. The 7 cards in his opening hand were a Blood Crypt, an Arid Mesa, a Reflecting Pool, a Sensei's Divining Top, a Reanimate, a Swords to Plowshares, and a Cathartic Reunion. Adam starts off this game by drawing and playing a City of Brass as his land for turn. He then passes the turn to Nate. Nate draws and plays a tapped Dwarven Ruins as his land for turn, and then decides to give the turn to Jordan. On his turn, Jordan draws and plays a Snow-Covered Island as his land for turn. He then taps this island to cast Ponder. He looks at the top 3 cards of his library, decides to rearrange them, and then draw a card. With nothing left, he passes the turn to Bill. Bill draws and plays a Command Tower as his land for turn. He taps this Command Tower to cast a Sensei's Divining Top. With nothing left, he goes to give the turn to Adam. On Bill's end step, Adam taps the City of Brass, taking 1 damage, to cast an Enlightened Tutor. It resolves, and he searches up a Mana Crypt to the top of his library. He then goes to his turn, untaps, draws, and for 0 mana, casts his Mana Crypt. He then taps his Mana Crypt to cast an Azorius Signet. With nothing else and with no land drop, he passes the turn to Nate. Nate untaps, draws, and plays a Mountain as his land for turn. He then taps for 2 mana to cast a Goblin Engineer. As it enters the battlefield, he puts a Sword of Feast and Famine into his graveyard. With nothing left, he gives the turn to Jordan. Jordan untaps, draws, and plays a Snow-Covered Island as his land for turn, and then gives the turn to Bill. Bill untaps, draws, and plays a Reflecting Pool as his land for turn. He then taps for 2 mana to cast a Cathartic Reunion, discarding 2 cards as an additional cost. It resolves and builds and draws 3. With nothing left, he gives the turn over to Adam. Adam untaps and in his upkeep wins his mana crypt trigger, not taking damage. He then draws and takes a damage from City of Brass to help produce enough mana to cast Alela Artful Provocateur. It resolves and he then gives the turn to Nate. Nate untaps, draws, and plays a mountain as his land for turn. He then decides to cast Shattering Spree, replicating it 2 times, paying a total of 3 red mana into it. He targets Adam's Azorius Signet, Adam's Mana Crypt, and Bill's Sensei's Divining Top. In response to the cast, Bill taps his Sensei's Divining Top to draw a card and put top back on top of his library. And as priorities get to him, Adam pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep, targeting the Shattering Spree that is targeting his Azorius Signet. It resolves, that 1 copy is countered, and then his Mana Crypt is destroyed by the final Shattering Spree. With nothing left, Nate passes the turn to Jordan. Jordan untaps, draws, and plays a snow-covered island as his land for turn. He then taps for 3 mana to transmute Muddle the Mixture, searching up a Scroll Rack to his hand. With nothing left, he passes the turn over to Bill. Bill untaps, draws, and plays a tapped Hall of the Bandit Lord as his land for turn. He then taps for 1 mana to cast a Sensei's Divining Top. With nothing left, he gives the turn over to Adam. Adam untaps, draws, and takes a damage from City of Brass to help produce enough mana to cast a Dimir Signet and getting a 1/1 fairy creature token on cast. The Signet resolves, and Adam, again missing his land drop, gives the turn over to Nate. Nate untaps, draws, and liking Bill's play, decides to also play a Hall of the Bandit Lord as his land for turn. He then taps for 2 mana to cast a Generator Servant. With nothing left, he passes the turn to Jordan. Jordan untaps, draws, and plays another snow-covered island as his land for turn. He then taps enough mana to cast a Thran Dynamo. He then taps this Thran Dynamo in order to cast a Fell Warstone, floating 1 colorless. With nothing left to do with his mana, however, he gives the turn to Bill, and the mana fizzles. Bill untaps, draws, and plays a Sulphurous Springs as his land for turn, and decides to just give the turn over to Adam. Adam untaps, draws, and takes another damage from City of Brass to tap his Dimir Signet to have enough mana to cast a Diabolic Intent, sacrificing 1 of his fairy tokens as an additional cost. He then searches up a card to his hands and then, for 0 mana, casts a Mox Opal. With nothing left, he gives the turn over to Nate. Nate untaps, draws, and plays a Rogue's Passage as his land for turn. He then pays 3 life to tap Hall of the Bandit Lord for mana and sacks his Dwarven Ruins to help cast Neheb the Eternal. He then decides to go to combat, and since it has haste due to Hall of the Bandit Lord, he swings Neheb at Jordan and his Generator Servant and Goblin Engineer at Bill. Neither declare any blockers. Jordan takes 4 damage, and Bill takes 3. In his second main phase, Nate adds 7 red mana into his mana pool due to Neheb's ability. He then, for 3 of this mana, casts a Wheel of Fortune. It resolves, everyone discards their hand and draws 7 more cards. He then uses 2 of this floating mana to cast a Dockside Extortionist, which, upon entering the battlefield, generates 6 treasures. He then uses 1 more of his floating mana to cast a Faithless Looting, drawing 2 cards, discarding 2, and unfortunately with nothing left to do, passes the turn to Jordan. Jordan untaps, draws, and plays a Cavern of Souls as his land for turn, this time deciding to name God as it enters the battlefield. He then taps for 5 mana to cast a Gilded Lotus. He then taps for 2 mana to cast a Copy Artifact targeting the Lotus. He then taps the copied Lotus along with a few lands to cast a Walk the Aeons. It resolves, and he then decides to just pass the turn to himself and go to his next turn. On this next turn, he untaps, draws, and plays a snow-covered island as his land for turn. He then taps the copied Gilded Lotus along with his Cavern of Souls to cast an uncounterable God Eternal Kefnet. He then decides to tap his Thran Dynamo to cast a Sensei's Divining Top, floating 2 colorless mana. He then decides to tap his Gilded Lotus and cast a Fact or Fiction floating 1 blue. He targets Nate with the Fact or Fiction and then reveals the top 5 cards of his library, which are a Narset, Parter of Veils, an Ancient Tomb, an Academy Ruins, a Force of Will, and a Snow-Covered Island. Nate decides to put the Narset, the Ancient Tomb, and the Academy Ruins in one pile, and the Force of Will and the Island in the other pile. Jordan chooses the pile with Narset, and then uses his floating blue mana to activate top, rearranging the top 3 cards of his library. He then taps for 3 mana to cast his Narset, Parter of Veils. He then uses the -2 ability of Narset to look at the top 4 cards of his library and reveals a Sapphire Medallion and puts it into his hand. He then taps for 2 mana to cast the Sapphire Medallion. Feeling like he's played enough Magic for this turn cycle, he decides to pass the turn to Bill. On Jordan's end step, Bill pays 1 mana to activate his Sensei's Divining Top, rearranging the top 3 cards of his library. He then goes to his turn, untaps, draws, and plays a Swamp as his land for turn. He then taps for 1 black mana to cast an Entomb, which, upon resolution, allows Bill to put a Razaketh the Foulblooded into his graveyard. He then taps for 2 mana to cast an Exhume, losing 4 total life from his lands. In response, Nate sacrifices 2 of his treasures to generate enough mana to cast a Desperate Ritual. He holds priority and sacrifices 2 more treasures to cast an Increasing Vengeance, targeting the ritual. Both of them resolve, and he adds 6 red mana to his mana pool. The Exhume resolves, and Bill decides to put Razaketh onto the battlefield, and Nate decides to put Sandstone Oracle onto the battlefield. As the Oracle enters the battlefield, Nate draws 4 cards due to the ETB effect. Bill decides to then go to combat. However, in response to going to combat, Nate uses his floating mana plus 1 additional to cast Price of Progress, holding priority to cast Increasing Vengeance, targeting the Price of Progress. The 3 copies of Price of Progress resolve. Nate then takes 18 damage, Jordan 6, Bill 24, and Adam then takes 6. Bill then proceeds to his combat phase, and then proceeds to his second main phase. In his second main phase, he taps his mana to cast a Bloodlust Insider. He then sacrifices this creature and then pays 2 life to activate Razaketh to tutor up a card to his hand. He then casts his Lotus Petal for 0 mana, and then, for 0 mana, casts a Chrome Mox, and as it enters the battlefield, he imprints Faithless Looting. He then sacrifices his Lotus Petal to cast a Leonin Relic Warder. When it enters the battlefield, he exiles 1 of Nate's treasure tokens. He then pays 2 life and sacrifices this creature to activate Razaketh and tutor up another card to his hand. With nothing left, he passes the turn to Adam. Adam untaps, draws, and plays an untapped Sea of Clouds as his land for turn. He then takes a damage from City of Brass and taps a few other mana in order to cast a Smothering Tithe, getting a 1/1 fairy creature token on cast, and then the Tithe resolves and he gives the turn to Nate. Nate untaps, draws, and does not pay for the Smothering Tithe tax. He then, for 0 mana, casts a Chrome Mox. When it enters, he imprints a Harsh Mentor. He then taps for 1 mana to cast a Soul Ring. He then taps his Soul Ring along with 2 other mana to cast a Treasonous Ogre. He then activates Goblin Engineer, sacrificing his Chrome Mox to get a Sword of Feast and Famine to the battlefield. He then pays 6 life to generate enough red mana to equip his Sword of Feast and Famine to Neheb. He then goes to combat. In response to going to combat, Bill casts Pyroblast, targeting Kefnet. In response to this Pyroblast, Jordan casts Pact of Negation, targeting Pyroblast, and saving his Kefnet. Nate then proceeds to combat and swings a 6/8 Neheb at Bill and a 4/4 Sandstone Oracle at Adam. The damage goes through, Bill cannot block due to Sword of Feast and Famine, and Bill then takes enough damage to lose the game, and Nate untaps all of his lands. He then goes to his second main phase and adds 10 red mana to his mana pool due to Neheb's ability. He then plays a Cavern of Souls as his land for turn and names Golem. He then uses his floating mana and taps Cavern of Souls to cast an uncounterable Blightsteel Colossus. With nothing left, he passes the turn to Jordan. Jordan untaps and in his upkeep pays for the pack trigger to not lose the game. He then draws, and due to Kefnet's ability, reveals the card he drew, which is a Temporal Manipulation. He taps his mana to cast this Temporal Manipulation, and does not pay the Smothering Tithe tax as he draws this card for turn. He then goes to his first main phase, and plays an Academy Ruins as his land for turn. He then pays mana and activates Academy Ruins to put a Scroll Rack from his graveyard onto the top of his library. He then taps his Sensei's Divining Top to draw this Scroll Rack and put the Divining Top back on top of his library, and then taps for enough mana to cast this Scroll Rack. He then activates Scroll Rack to put one card from his hand back onto the top of his library. In case you're wondering, this card is a Temporal Manipulation. What Scroll Rack being here allows him to do is go to his next turn and cast another copy of Temporal Manipulation due to Kefnet's ability. He can then activate Scroll Rack again to continually put this card back on top, taking infinite turns and winning through clearing the board of blockers and then swinging out with Kefnet, dealing enough damage to his opponents to win the game. We hope you enjoyed this doubleheader. Unfortunately, the games were a little bit on the shorter side, but I do think they were filled with a lot of action, and I honestly found them incredibly interesting to watch while the games were being played. In terms of a short post-game recap for this game too, I do want to give the most valuable card to Sensei's Divining Top. This card really allowed Jordan to set up his perfect turn when the time came. It allowed him to order his library to keep Temporal Manipulation exactly where he wanted it and not draw it until he was ready to start going off. It was a bit unfortunate we didn't get to see that Blightsteel Colossus do, Blightsteel Colossus things, but there's always next time. Remember to vote for the deck that you want to see again in the poll by clicking on the eye in the upper right hand corner of the video. Lets us know which one of these decks you want to see again. So if you were a little disappointed that Alela didn't get to do many Alela things and Neheb didn't get to pop off super strong, be sure to vote for them by using the poll in the upper right hand corner of the video. That being said, that is all we have for this video. We do hope you enjoyed it, and we hope you're excited for the finale. Now that the 4 seasonal games have concluded, we can let you know who the finalists will be, and they will be Blue Pod, Hullen, Alela, and the winner of the first game tonight's Kaalia. So expect that game next week. It should be an exciting one. And if you want to vote for your favorite commanders for the favorites match of season 1, that'll be coming out in a few weeks, but be sure to go back on the previous videos and vote for your favorites if you haven't already. That does conclude this video, however. We here at Casually Competitive really hope you enjoyed this video. Remember, if you do want to go above and beyond and help support the channel, links for everything that we've mentioned are in the description. But if nothing else, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave it a like. It lets us know which videos you do like and don't like, and helps us kind of formulate our content around that. That being said, I am Joseph, this is Casually Competitive MTG, and we will see you next time.